bills, tax bills?
Yes.
And how did he do that?
What you do is you deflate the value of the asset, and then you put in a request to the tax department for a...
There is a bodega on a corner in Queens that opens at 6 and closes when the block stops moving. The owner's name is Marisol Cabrera. She has run the register for 19 years, and in 19 years, she has boiled the whole business down to one commandment. The tag on the shelf and the number on the register have to match. She does not care which one is wrong. A customer holds up a can of beans. The shelf says $2, the register rings 3, and that customer does not want a lecture about suppliers. One of those numbers is lying. Fix the tag or fix the machine. Until they match, everything you say across the counter is just noise. On the morning in question, the small television above the lottery machine was on with the sound off. A regular tapped it with his coffee cup. Marisol turned the volume up for the first time since the blackout, because the man on the screen was about to audit a store she recognized. Not a store with shelves. A store made of slogans. Keep Marisol in mind. This is a story about a brand and a register. And about the morning, a man in a plain suit asked politely whether the two had ever matched. The man was Dan Bongino. He did not raise his voice. He did not do the cable news snarl. He set one sentence on the table, flat and heavy, and let it sit there. He had come to show that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the biggest fraud Congress had ever seen. Smash that like button right now and type the word sunlight in the comments if you believe the money behind a movement should sit where everyone can see it. And stay with us, because what Dan Bongino lifted out of that briefcase and the question Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez never quite answered is exactly the kind of thing Washington has spent a very long time making sure you never get to see. The room did not erupt when the sentence landed. It did not gasp. It went still. The particular stillness that makes you suddenly aware of the camera motors and of staffers who have stopped blinking. And then, right on cue, Ocasio-Cortez laughed. Not the cornered laugh. The curated one. The one you can practically watch being rehearsed for clips. Anyone who has watched politics long enough knows that laugh is a tool, a gavel's cousin, built to make the other person smaller. She leaned into the microphone like a woman already editing her own highlight reel. The blazer caught the overhead lights at exactly the right angle, because of course it did. She delivered her lines like an audition for the next viral montage. The podcast bro, the failed cop, the obligatory bit about gold coins and doomsday food buckets. All of it timed. Her side of the dais chuckled. The phones came out, and somewhere a staffer was already titling tonight's clip. A moment built for the feed, designed to end an argument without touching what the argument is about. And the strangest part was how familiar it felt. Politics is a sport where nobody keeps score except the algorithm riding in every pocket in the room. Bongino did not flinch, did not grin, did not bite. He sat with his hands folded, the way a man sits when he has waited out longer and darker silences than this one. Performers feed on reaction the way a campfire feeds on dry wood. He gave her none. The laughter thinned. Her smile twitched. A fraction, no more. The twitch of a person discovering that mockery will not steer this particular car. He asked, flat as asphalt, "You finished?" Nothing macho in it. It was administrative. A man closing an agenda item. She shot back that she was just getting started, reaching for a swagger contest. But the room could already feel the rhythm change hands. Then he reached down and opened a briefcase that looked more workhorse than prop. Worn leather, no gleaming hardware, no flourish. Out of it came a single manila folder. Thin, unglamorous, the kind of object you would find in a municipal office. He placed it where every camera could read the label, and the label, in big plain type, was a punchline with no joke attached. Ocasio-Cortez, the fraud. Call it fair, cheap, or theater. What you cannot call it is accidental, a visual engineered to travel. He did not open with her tweets or her tone. He opened with money because that is where people open when the gloves come off. He put a number in the air. $47 million? And then he let it hang, the way a preacher hangs a word above a congregation and waits to see who breathes first. He described it as a flow, a river of donor cash moving through a maze of entities. Political committees, limited liability companies, consulting invoices, arrows bending back on themselves like a child's crayon sketch of a tornado. His claim was simple. Every transfer leaves a footprint. Every payment drops a crumb. And he had walked the trail, and he had brought the trail with him. Somewhere in that minute, the hearing stopped being a sparring match. It became a man announcing that he was holding receipts, and that being liked was no longer on his schedule. But before wading into the weeds, he pulled back. Start simple, he suggested. Start with how a person lives, what she chooses, what she signals when she believes nobody is grading the choices. He produced a lease agreement. A luxury apartment in Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. $3,500 a month with the amenity list of a lifestyle advertisement. And here he was careful, because the trap was not the rent. Members of Congress live between two worlds. D.C. prices are D.C. prices. Comfort is not a felony. His point was narrower and sharper. She markets herself as the patron saint of people who will never afford that building's lobby. He did not say guilty. He said, explain the contradiction. That is a different kind of knife. Then came the list. Cheaper apartments within walking distance of hers. Buildings without rooftop pools, without concierge desks. Buildings where the elevator smells like somebody's takeout. A rhetorical trap plainly built, and it worked by forcing one small question. If the brand is solidarity with the squeezed, why do the personal choices read like an escape route from the squeeze? She fired back that it was normal. The cost of doing the job. And she was not wrong that Washington is expensive in a way only Washington manages, but he kept circling one word, choice, like a man tapping the same spot on a map. The issue was never the rent. The issue was the message the rent was sending. Then he pivoted to the climate messaging, the signature issue, the one that turned a freshman into a headline machine. And he treated it not as an opinion but as a contract, one she had drafted with her own mouth. If you tell a country its house is on fire, you do not get to wander out of the burning building holding a marshmallow and call it networking. He claimed records of dozens of flights. First class, business class. He framed it as carbon arithmetic done from a leather seat, the kind that makes ordinary people feel lectured. Is that a fair way to measure a member of Congress who travels for a living? Maybe, maybe not. And that ambiguity was the engine of it. It made the audience argue with itself. The subtext, though, was not ambiguous. If sacrifice is the sermon, why does the preacher keep flying premium? She reached for the obvious defense. Official business, being where the work requires her to be. In a functioning democracy, that is a legitimate answer. But he was not disputing the necessity of travel. He was prosecuting the symbolism of indulgence, and American politics runs on symbolism the way cars run on gasoline. Then he held up a photograph he described as Miami Beach, taken during a brutal stretch of winter. The room's temperature changed. The shift a room makes when someone produces the old yearbook photo you had hoped stayed lost. A fundraiser, he said. A beach mansion. A champagne mood. Whether every detail survives scrutiny hardly mattered in the moment. Because images do what images do. They tell the story faster than any paragraph can catch it. And the story this one told was that there are two of her. One on the beach. One on the timeline. And a costume change happening somewhere between the posts. It was scheduled, she answered. It is being twisted. Context matters. And context does matter, especially in a politics that lives and dies on the selective clip. But he cut across her, because he was pacing the morning like a prosecutor pacing a closing, and the pace itself was part of the persuasion. He moved on to policing, the slogan war, the debate that long ago collapsed into a war of definitions. What does defund mean? What does reimagine mean? What does abolish mean? And who takes the hit if the country guesses wrong? He framed it as one more contradiction, and he brought paper. Disclosure documents, her security spending. The implication sat there in plain view. A protection umbrella over one person, held by a movement that preaches standing in the rain. And here the argument turned genuinely uncomfortable. Because even people who cannot stand her politics understand why a high-profile woman would want security. She receives threats. That is believable. Public life in America stopped being gentle some time ago. Nobody serious disputes it. So he did not dispute it. He widened the lens instead. Does the cashier locking up a bodega at midnight get to hire a detail? Does the old man walking home from the pharmacy get a trained escort? Does the kid crossing the wrong block get anything at all? In Queens, behind her register, Marisol Cabrera put down the pricing gun. It was not an accusation. It was a moral equation. And moral equations are what this country fights about when it cannot agree on facts. The room went quiet. Not in agreement. In discomfort. The discomfort of having to weigh one person's fear against another person's exposure. Even the people who dislike Bongino could hear the hook land. Safety becomes a luxury the moment it is privatized. Then he turned the spotlight inward, toward her own office. The young staffers. The idealists who signed on believing they were joining a movement, not a payroll. He read from ethics-related complaints, some anonymous, some sworn, unpaid overtime, relentless pressure. This kind of workplace stories that sound eerily identical, whether the boss is progressive, conservative, corporate, or nonprofit. That is the nasty little truth. Everybody loves workers' rights until they are the one writing the schedule. She objected that anonymous complaints are easy to file and hard to prove. She is right about that. Which is exactly why his phrasing was so careful. He never touched the word proven. His words were on record, filed, reported. 3 words with paperwork behind them and no verdict inside them. He was painting a public champion of labor who, behind the office door, might treat labor as a consumable. And he let the audience decide whether that picture felt plausible. By now, the folder on the table had stopped being paperwork. It had become a mirror held up to a brand. Brands hate mirrors. Then he conceded something, almost casually, and the concession was the most dangerous sentence of the hour. Hypocrisy is not always a crime. Sometimes it is just ugly. Sometimes it is just disappointing. Sometimes it is simply what happens when a slogan becomes a career. That was true. All of it. He gave it freely because he was about to flip to the next tab, and his tone shifted just enough to notice, the way a driver eases the radio down before a hard conversation. This next part, he told the room, stops being about optics. It becomes about numbers, systems, how the money moved. Those words landed like a draft through an old window. Anyone who has watched enough hearings knows that pivot. It is the moment the theater leans towards something that can actually ruin people. Whether it turns out true, half-true, inflated, or merely weaponized. He began sketching what he called a web. Brand new Congress, Justice Democrats, courage to change. Names that sound righteous on a t-shirt, and that, in the wrong story, sound like labels on a shell game. Donors give small. 20 here, 50 there. They believe they are feeding a cause. Then the dollars start hopping, entity to entity, committee to consultant, until accountability goes soft at the edges. Routine political infrastructure, she countered. And plenty of it is. That is precisely the problem. A haystack made of routine is the easiest place in the world to lose a needle. He mentioned consultants, internal allies, invoice language of magnificent vagueness, services, operations, strategic support, phrases that can mean diligent work or nothing at all, legally either way. And then he stopped, right at the edge. The pause of a man letting the room wonder whether the next page is a turning point or a cliffhanger. He never said the word illegal. He talked about the arrangement instead, a house whose doors never quite close. Money enters, money circulates, money exits somewhere else. And by the time anyone tries to follow it, the trail looks like spaghetti flung at a whiteboard. He gave the arrangement a name, creative compliance, a phrase that sounds harmless right up until you ask why it exists. It exists because plain compliance would invite plain questions. She smirked at first, the smirk of a person confident the other side is bluffing. The smirk did not survive the next minute, because he slowed everything down and began naming people instead of structures. Advisors, consultants, trusted allies. A tight circle in his telling, forever orbiting the same center of gravity. Not a conspiracy. Just what a political ecosystem grows into when loyalty is worth more than distance. He gestured at a chart. Squint. And it looked like a subway map drawn by a man with a grudge against commuters. Lines doubling back, arrows pointing against intuition. Every route, eventually, looping home to the same few stations. Then came the question that hung in the air longer than it had any right to. At what point does complexity stop being a necessity and start being camouflage? She reached for the grassroots defense. Movements need infrastructure. Consultants do not work for free. Organizing costs money. All of it true, at least on paper. The room knew it was true. That is why nobody clapped. And Bongino nodded along, which was somehow worse because agreement drains the heat out of a fight and leaves only the arithmetic. Then, let's get specific. Specificity is always dangerous in a building that runs on generalities. He flipped a page and raised the payments to a romantic partner. He framed it not as scandal but as curiosity, which cut deeper. The name landed differently than the entities had because it was not political. It was personal. Personal details hit harder even when nothing about them is illegal. His questions were small and square. What work was performed? What deliverables exist? Which emails, which memos tie the compensation to an outcome? He did not claim the answers were missing from the universe. He claimed he could not find them. A subtle distinction, a crucial one. The work was real, she shot back. Digital strategy is not always visible. Not everything leaves a paper trail. Also true. And the room could feel how messy actual work is compared to the clean lines everyone wants drawn around it. He did not argue. He went back to the donors. He told the story of one hypothetical supporter, a person juggling shifts and bills, who gave because hope was cheaper than cynicism that month. He did not claim to speak for that person. He only asked whether anyone at the table had considered how this maze looks from that kitchen, a classic populist move. Even people allergic to populism recognize the power of it when it is aimed well. The question was never whether the payments were lawful. The question was whether they rhyme with the moral pitch that built the movement. By now, the hearing had stopped resembling a trial. It resembled a slow, uncomfortable therapy session for American politics. Everyone forced to sit with contradictions they usually scroll past. Her posture changed again. Not collapse, compression. The tightening of a swimmer bracing for cold water. Her attorney leaned in and whispered. She waved him off. She would fight on narrative, not on detail. Narrative had always been her home field. He pivoted again. Imagery this time. You could almost hear the collective groan of people who knew what was coming. The border visit. The photograph that became an icon whether it earned the job or not. He framed it carefully. He acknowledged the emotional weight of the issue. He acknowledged the suffering, which is real regardless of anyone's politics. Then he asked the question nobody in the room wanted assigned to them. How much of politics is witnessing pain? And how much is capturing it? There were multiple photos that day, he claimed. Some emotional, some mundane, some smiling, some staged. He did not call the emotion fake. He asked whether a camera changes how emotion gets performed. Anyone who has ever seen a selfie taken at a funeral knows exactly how uncomfortable that question is. She was overwhelmed, she told them. Moments shift. Grief does not follow a script. True again. Which is why the accusation stayed implied and never once stood up straight. Then came the text messages. Allegedly from staff. Allegedly about optics. Allegedly about timing. He read them the way a stage manager reads stage directions, not the way a prosecutor reads confessions. Make sure the photographers are ready. That register. The dialect of modern activism, where awareness and exposure blur into a single word. He did not call it manipulation. He called it strategy, and let the audience decide whether the distinction still means anything. The discomfort deepened because most people know strategy when they see it. They hate admitting it. How often does a symbolic moment become a fundraising moment? And does that conversion cheapen the original cause? Fundraising is how movements survive, came the reply. Awareness without resources goes nowhere. Not wrong, not remotely wrong. And yet it did nothing for the queasy feeling that follows monetized outrage around a room. The chamber split. Not along party lines, but along tolerance lines. How much performance will you accept before authenticity cracks under the makeup? Next came the immigration rhetoric. The word choices. The metaphors. The historical comparisons that start fires faster than anyone puts them out. He raised the injuries among law enforcement, not as proof of cause and effect, he was explicit about that, but as a reminder that words ripple outward, and the ripples do not check with the speaker first. Should a politician answer for the interpretations of her most extreme supporters? That question has haunted American politics for years. Nobody has produced a satisfying answer yet. Moral clarity requires strong language, she argued. Injustice demands urgency. His counter came quietly. Does urgency excuse imprecision? And can imprecision get somebody hurt? Not an accusation. A philosophical dilemma wearing a witness badge. Then he did something almost cruel in its simplicity. He counted. Bills sponsored, visits made, follow-ups completed. He laid the totals beside the noise, and the totals were thin, not zero. Thin. Thinner than the brand would have you believe? And this was the moment the hearing slid from scandal towards something sadder, because it touched a nerve that runs far past one politician. How often visibility substitutes for impact? How often attention stands in for outcomes? His suggestion was blunt underneath its calm. Somewhere along the line, the media presence stopped being a means to the work. It became the work. Awareness changes culture, she countered, and culture drags policy behind it. A defensible theory, also a wonderfully convenient one, in a season when the policy is stalled. Then the donors returned. The large ones this time. Organizations, agendas, money that arrived after the spotlight did. He alleged no foreign hand and no crime. He asked about alignment, about incentive. Who profits when the narrative stays hot and the solution stays vague? That question was uncomfortable because it refuses to stay in one room. It follows everyone home. Insinuation, she called it, bordering on character assassination. His reply barely rose above the microphone. Insinuation is what grows in the gap when transparency stops halfway. Full sunlight leaves no shadows to misread. The tension in the chamber stopped feeling partisan around then. It felt existential. This was no longer left against right. It was a quieter question. Can modern politics survive its own marketing department? Even the cameras seemed to hush, waiting to see which way the story would tip. He paused. Longer this time. The next part he told the room was about power, not money. Amazon, Queens, the jobs promised, and the jobs that never arrived. A story of victory or a story of defeat, depending entirely on where you were standing when the deal died. He walked the familiar argument that blocking a corporate campus can look like justice or like self-sabotage, and that the lens decides. She defended the decision the way she always has, protecting a community from displacement, from exploitation. There is merit in that. Economists still argue both sides of it. In the bodega, Marisol rang up a lottery ticket without looking away from the screen. Her cousin had applied for one of those jobs. Then Bongino introduced the angle that rarely gets said into a microphone. Can economic stagnation be politically useful? Is a population struggling to stay afloat easier to organize than a population climbing? He labeled it a cynical question, not an accusation. But cynicism has a way of sticking to the walls after the speaker stops talking. The room felt colder once it was out. He referenced an email, allegedly private, allegedly candid. He read it slowly, and in his telling, the language was about voter composition, not community prosperity. The distinction sat there like a stone in a shoe. Misinterpretation, she snapped. Private messages are not policy. True. And yet private messages have a habit of revealing priorities more honestly than press releases ever will. He let the tension sit unresolved, a chord refusing to land on major or minor. This was not about demonizing success, he offered. It was about a ledger nobody likes to open. Who benefits from perpetual struggle? Who benefits from real improvement? Stable, upwardly mobile voters are less predictable, less emotionally dependent. Plenty of strategists acknowledge that math in private and deny it in public. Hearing it out loud made people shift in their seats. As the session wore on, the mood turned again, toward isolation. She looked down the dais for backup. Her allies had discovered urgent business inside their own notepads. Nobody jumped in. Nobody threw a rescue line. Nobody reframed the debate into friendlier territory. Politics teaches you early who stands with you, right up until the math changes. In this telling, the math had changed. Bongino gestured at the statements her colleagues had released. Technically supportive, emotionally distant. The kind of statement that manages to say nothing while pretending to say something. He did not gloat over it. He observed it in the tone of a man describing weather. Storms form when the pressure drops. Pressure drops when risk rises. She seemed for a moment to register that she was standing alone inside her own brand. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its stagecraft. Persecution, she called it. Fear of progressive change, coordinated resistance. Lines that have carried her through storms before, and there was no reason not to reach for them again. But they landed differently now. Not because they were false, because they were familiar. Familiarity dulls even the sharpest slogan. Bongino listened all the way through. Then he went almost gentle, and the gentleness was the heaviest thing he had done all day. Maybe none of this began with malice, he suggested. Maybe it began with belief, momentum, attention, and the quiet assumption that rules bend around people who matter. Power rarely corrupts all at once. It corrodes slowly. And by the time you notice, the original mission is a shape in the distance. Familiar, abstract, and very far away. He closed the folder. Not because he was finished. Because he knew when to stop. The chairman cleared his throat. Procedure poured back into the room. The hearing rolled toward its next phase, and no verdict came with it. No handcuffs, no villain formally named. What remained was a fog of questions and competing narratives. And every person in that room understood the story was not over, because modern politics does not end cleanly. It just changes platforms. The chairman's voice receded into boilerplate, but the echo outlasted the gavel. Around the room, the veterans were already doing the after-hearing math. Which headlines, which donors, which talking points would still be breathing by morning? Ocasio-Cortez gathered herself the way seasoned politicians do. Spine straightening, face settling into something composed enough to pass for calm. She knows the physics as well as anyone. Hearings do not end careers on their own. Narratives do that, slowly, screen by screen, conversation by conversation. The real audience was never in the room. It was scattered across couches and kitchen tables and phone screens, deciding what to believe. Bongino, for his part, declined the victory lap. Triumph is a dangerous look when the facts are still contested. He framed the morning as presentation, not prosecution, a careful phrase that bought him plausible restraint. In politics, I showed always play safer than I proved, and he knew precisely which side of that line he was standing on. He repeated it almost to redundancy. Questions remain open. Investigations continue. Conclusions are premature. It sounded cautious. It also kept the spotlight bolted exactly where he wanted it. She went the other way. Motive over minutia. She talked about why she entered politics at all, about being underestimated, about challenging systems that profit from inertia. It is a genuine arc, and it still lands with people who see their own reflection in it. Movements are messy, she reminded the room. Change never arrives in a clean spreadsheet. But the air had shifted while she spoke. The conversation was no longer about ideals. It was about trust. Trust is the quiet currency of politics. Harder to count than votes. Easier to lose than to earn back. A politician can survive being called radical, naive, even hypocritical. Surviving doubt from her own base is a different problem entirely. The hearing never declared her untrustworthy. It did something more durable. It planted the suggestion that the story might be more complicated than the brand. And complexity is kryptonite to a movement built on clarity and urgency. People will argue with an ideology all day. Ambiguity is what wears them out. The cameras powered down. The staffers started whispering. The postgame began. Analysts would spend the week arguing whether Bongino crossed a line or simply walked one that had been ignored too long. Supporters called the questions loaded, the framing unfair, the tone hostile. Critics called it what scrutiny looks like once charisma stops deflecting it. Both camps clipped their favorite 30 seconds and behaved as if the rest of the morning had never happened. Outside the building, the reaction split along the usual seams. Some saw a necessary challenge to a political celebrity long shielded by her own momentum. Others saw a coordinated operation against a woman who unsettles comfortable power. And most people, if you caught them being honest, saw pieces of both and had no idea where to put that discomfort. Discomfort, more than outrage, is what keeps a story alive. Far from Washington, the hearing landed in break rooms and kitchens, in neighborhoods where politics stays abstract, right up until it does not. People who once shared her clips with pride rewatched them with narrowed eyes, hunting for the signal they had missed. People who had always disliked her felt vindicated without being able to explain why. And in between sat the quiet majority, the ones who want to believe in something without feeling played. That is where the damage, if damage there was, becomes hardest to measure. Not in a polling dip, not in a cable segment, in the slow erosion of faith. Once a supporter starts wondering whether every impassioned speech is also a pitch, something structural has moved. Politics turns transactional instead of aspirational. Cynicism lets itself in. And cynicism, once seated, does not give up the chair. Bongino gave a single interview afterward, choosing his words like a man who knows how quickly confidence curdles into arrogance. He was not celebrating, he insisted. There's nothing joyful about watching belief collide with doubt. The hearing was exposure, not punishment. An invitation to accountability, not a verdict. The framing did real work for him. It let him look reluctant, almost burdened. And reluctance persuades in a culture exhausted by performed certainty. He kept steering toward patterns instead of people. Systems instead of personalities. The story, he implied, could belong to almost anyone who rises fast and learns the wrong lessons early. Fame is a solvent. It dissolves boundaries unless somebody actively maintains them. The idea resonated precisely because it required no villain, only incentives. And incentives shape behavior more reliably than any character test ever has. She, meanwhile, moved into strategy mode. Her statements tightened, more legalistic, less lyrical. Process, due diligence. The dangers of concluding from incomplete information. The shift signaled awareness and maybe even vulnerability, while admitting nothing. Whether it read as growth or as retreat depended on who was watching. A few colleagues edged away in the subtle grammar politicians use when uncertainty enters the room. Concern without commitment, solidarity without specificity. Nobody wants to be found defending the thing that later becomes indefensible. That is not cowardice, exactly. It is survival instinct, sharpened over years of watching careers implode. Still, isolation is a lonely teacher. The hearing never answered the question at its center, which may be exactly why it worked. Is she a symbol of authentic change buckling under impossible scrutiny? Or a case study in branding overtaking belief? The truth is likely messier than either camp will accept. People are rarely one thing, least of all people carrying the projected hopes of millions. Projection is a heavy load. It bends whatever carries it. The clips kept circulating for days, each one stripped of context and reassembled into ammunition. Questions remained became both shield and sword, supporters repeating it to hold off conclusions, critics repeating it to justify suspicion. The story refused to settle, because settling requires consensus, and consensus is a dying art. Some observers noted correctly that nothing in the hearing, taken alone, proved wrongdoing. Others noted just as correctly that politics has never waited for proof to demand accountability. It runs on plausibility, repetition, a narrative that fits what people already suspected. Once that narrative exists, facts get demoted to supporting cast. That is not new. It is still unsettling to watch. There was a harder realization underneath. Most of the charges aimed at her would stick to half the profession. The revolving door between activism and consulting. The monetizing of outrage. The curated image. If that is disqualifying, the field empties out fast. And if it is not, then why does it sting so much aimed at the one who promised to be different? That question outlasted every allegation in the folder. In quiet moments, even some of her critics admitted they had wanted her to succeed. They had wanted proof that idealism could touch power without dissolving in it. They had wanted one counterexample to the rule that everybody eventually plays the same game. Disappointment cuts deeper than anger. Disappointment is what fuels the longest arguments. So the story ends, for now, without a resignation and without a vindication. It ends in the gray zone, where people quietly renegotiate what they expect from the people who speak for them. Must politicians be saints, or merely less cynical than average? Is purity a fair demand inside a system engineered to reward compromise and performance? And if the answer is no, what exactly is left to believe in? What the morning exposed more than any single congresswoman was the fragility of modern political trust. We build heroes fast and dismantle them faster, usually with the same set of tools. The feeds amplify certainty and starve patience. Nuance suffocates somewhere in between. In that climate, even sincere effort starts to look calculated. And once behavior is suspected of calculation, no document on earth can fully clear it. The cycle will churn. New stories will elbow this one down the feed. But the questions underneath it are not going anywhere, because they were never really about one congresswoman or one commentator. They are about how power, money, and image braid together in a culture addicted to being seen. About whether a movement can stay honest after it learns how to win. About whether voters can ever fully trust the people who speak most passionately in their name. In Queens, Marisol Cabrera closed out her register a little after 11. She counted the drawer twice, the way she does every night, because the drawer does not care how the day felt. Then she walked the near aisle with the pricing gun and fixed 2 tags that had drifted from the register's memory. 19 years, and the rule has never once needed updating. The shelf and the register have to match. Nobody gets to keep both numbers. She thought about the woman on the screen, the one with the beautiful sentences about people like her block. She thought about the man with the thin folder who never raised his voice. She did not decide who won. That was not her department. Her department was simpler. Somebody had finally walked the aisle with a pricing gun, item by item, and checked the tags against the register. Maybe the tags hold up. Maybe they do not. But the checking is not persecution. The checking is the job. The man read the numbers. He asked his questions. The record is more complete now than it was when the room sat down. That is the work. That is what the morning was. That is enough.